So Paul concludes. The translators really messed us up. They broke the chapter. They stopped. They shouldn't have. What's the first word of chapter 8? Therefore. There is therefore. In other words, you need to know what came in the verse before. Because if you have a therefore, you need to find out what it's there for. I wish the translators had left verse 1 in chapter 7 and made it verse 26. Because what Paul says is, I thank God that it's going to be Jesus that does it. There is therefore now no condemnation to those who are in Christ Jesus, who do not walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. The last part, almost all of your center column reference Bibles will have a note in the middle of verse 1. And that note will tell you that the end of verse 1 was interpolated from verse 4 back into verse 1. In other words, when the translators were translating out of the Greek, the end of verse 1 does not appear in verse 1, it appears in verse 4. And your translators grabbed it and stuck it at the end of verse 1. I can't speak for dead men, but I think they did it because they could not believe that the sentence should end with, there is therefore now no condemnation to those who are in Christ Jesus. I don't think their religious mindset would let them say that. I think they were going with the 10 instead of the 2. I think their idea was, if you're going to conquer that land, you're going to walk right to conquer that land. You're going to do right to conquer that land. And how many of you know that God did not promise the children of Israel the land of Canaan because they did right? God promised the children of Israel the land of Canaan because they believed right. When you get to Hebrews 4 and it tells you why they didn't take the land, it never says because they lived in sin. It says because of their unbelief, they did not enter into that land of rest. It does not say because they disobeyed this and that. Because of their unbelief, they did not enter in. So their issue was not that they weren't morally of high character. Their issue was that they did not believe that it could be done without their help. That's why instead of looking at grapes, they looked at giants. Now, you're always going to have a minority of people that get this. Paul was the minority. The early church, where there was the minority. There was Caleb and Joshua that said, forget the giants, man. Let's go in there and get that food. God's on our side. He didn't bring us all the way here to get us killed. And if he did, I've been to the promised land. It'll be worth spilling blood on that land. Wait till you see it, man. Let's go. There will always be someone that says it's worth living in faith. It's worth operating in freedom. Verse 4, let's look at that interpolated verse. Verse 4 of chapter 8, and we'll move on. That the righteous, let's go from 2, sorry. We need the context. For the law of the Spirit of life in Christ Jesus, gosh, I love this verse, has made me free from the law of sin and death. I now have the Spirit of Jesus Christ in me, which sets me free from performance, because it's His performance, not my performance. For what the law could not do, in that it was weak through the flesh. Every time my flesh tried to keep the law was too weak to help me. God did it by sending His own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh. On account of sin, He condemned sin in the flesh. Whose sin was condemned in the flesh of Jesus? Jesus' sin or your sin? Our sin. Jesus had no sin. Hebrews is very clear. He never failed. He never sinned. So whose sin is being condemned in Jesus' body? Ours. How can sin be condemned in Jesus and then be condemned in you? How is it possible for God to be a just God and condemn sin in Jesus, and you receive that, and then you sin, and God says, I condemn that? I'll be honest with you, that God is a liar. Because Jesus thought He was going to the cross to take away the sin of the world. In fact, He was so convinced of it, He said at Calvary, it is finished. And before He died, He held a cup up in front of His disciples and He said, take a drink. This is the blood of the New Testament, shed for the remission of sin. So if we're wrong, and God is waiting to condemn you for the next failure, even Jesus was deceived at the cross. He thought He was having your sin and my sin condemned in His flesh. And God cannot condemn it twice. And Paul gets it in chapter 8 and says, therefore, there's no condemnation because Jesus has had sin condemned in Him.